Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey into powerful ideas, remarkable figures, and the hidden forces that shaped our world. Today, we step into the life of a man who refused to kneel before power, who used words sharper than swords, and who dared to question everything his society considered sacred. His name was Voltaire. Imagine a world where kings ruled without doubt, churches decided what was true or false, and anyone who disagreed could be silenced, imprisoned, or erased. In that world, most people obeyed. Most people remained quiet. But not Voltaire. With his brilliant mind, razor-sharp humor, and fearless spirit, he fought for something far greater than himself, the freedom to think, to speak, and to question. This story is not simply a biography. It is a torch, lighting the path of anyone who has ever felt trapped by rules they did not believe in, or by a society that fears free thought. As you listen, you will not only improve your English, but you will also discover how one person's courage can change the course of history and leave a legacy that continues to echo across centuries. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, and if you'd like to support our work, you are welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support helps us continue creating stories that truly matter. Get ready for one of the most thought-provoking journeys in the history of human ideas. Let's begin the remarkable story of Voltaire, the rebel philosopher who defied kings and churches. Voltaire was born in Paris in 1694, at a time when France was one of the most powerful but also one of the most controlled societies in Europe. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had turned the nation into a glittering symbol of royal authority. His palace at Versailles shone with gold, and his court was filled with artists, poets, and soldiers who praised the monarchy. But behind this beauty, something darker existed: strict censorship, religious intolerance, and a rigid social hierarchy where the church and the crown dominated every aspect of life. Questioning them was not only dangerous, it was nearly unthinkable. Into this world came François-Marie Arouet, the young boy who would later become known as Voltaire. His family belonged to the educated bourgeoisie, not noble enough to hold great political power, yet privileged enough to receive a refined education. His father worked as a lawyer for the king, and he expected the same path for his son, a life of stability, obedience, and respect for authority. But the young François was not like most children. He was curious, witty, and loved words more than rules. Even as a boy, he used humor to challenge teachers, priests, and anyone who tried to force ideas upon him. Paris itself played a powerful role in shaping his early consciousness. It was a city of contrasts: grand churches beside crowded streets, intellectual salons where ideas were whispered behind closed doors, and coffeehouses buzzing with debate. Some people dared to discuss new ideas from England and Holland, places where thinkers like John Locke spoke openly about liberty and reason. François absorbed all of this like fire drinking oil. Yet, the France of his childhood was not a land of intellectual freedom. The Catholic Church held enormous influence. Its decisions shaped education, morality, and even the books people were allowed to read. The state used censorship to crush dangerous ideas, and questioning religious dogma could lead to imprisonment or exile. In this environment, truth was not something to be discovered, it was something to be accepted without question. However, something was changing in Europe. The Age of Enlightenment was beginning to flicker, a movement that encouraged reason, science, and freedom of thought. It challenged old traditions and asked daring questions: what is truth? Who decides right and wrong? Should kings rule because of divine right, or because they serve the people? The young Voltaire was growing up right at the edge of this intellectual storm. He would soon become one of its strongest winds. But at this early point in his life, he faced a choice familiar to many young people even now: follow the path others built for him, or carve his own. And deep inside him, something whispered, question everything. From an early age, François-Marie Arouet felt torn between two worlds. On one side was the safe, predictable life his father planned for him: a respectable career in law, a steady income, and silence in the face of authority. On the other side was a growing fire, a hunger for truth, a desire to speak freely, and the thrilling power of ideas. This internal conflict was not a simple childhood phase. It was the beginning of a lifelong battle that would shape his destiny. Young François studied at the prestigious Jesuit college Louis le Grand, where discipline and devotion to the church were strict. He read classical literature, learned rhetoric, and mastered the art of argument. Teachers noticed his exceptional intelligence, but they also saw something dangerous. He did not simply repeat ideas, he questioned them. He challenged explanations, pushed boundaries, and laughed at the contradictions he found in sacred texts or royal decisions. His mind was too alive to accept silence. The problem was clear: a society built on unquestionable authority could not tolerate a mind like his. Humor became his secret weapon. He wrote verses mocking teachers, nobles, and traditions. His words traveled quickly around Paris, reaching ears that were amused, and those that were offended. The more he observed society, the more he saw hypocrisy everywhere. Churches preached humility while living in luxury. Kings claimed divine authority while ignoring the suffering of ordinary people. François felt an uncomfortable truth pressing against his heart: the world he lived in was not built on justice, but on fear. Yet he was still just a young man. He had no army, no throne, no official power. What could he possibly use to fight such a massive system? The answer revealed itself slowly: ideas. Ideas were invisible, but they could travel. Ideas were fragile, but they could ignite revolutions. He began to understand that if he could master words, he could challenge the world. This realization marked the first crack in his old identity. He no longer saw himself as a future lawyer. He saw himself as a writer, a thinker, someone born to provoke thought rather than protect tradition. His father was furious. Writers were seen as dangerous troublemakers, especially those who questioned the church or the crown. To write freely in France at that time was not simply a career choice, it was a risk to one's safety, reputation, and even life. But François could not turn away from this path. Every question he asked made him feel more alive. Every contradiction he exposed made him believe he had a purpose. The more he learned, the more he sensed a storm approaching. He stood at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward meant leaving behind the life expected of him. At this moment, let me ask you something: have you ever felt the weight of expectations pushing you in one direction while your heart pulled you toward another? If so, you already understand the battle that began inside Voltaire long before he became a famous philosopher. He was not yet the Voltaire the world would remember, but the seeds had been planted. The real struggle was about to begin. The moment François chose the path of ideas, his life accelerated like a river breaking free from its quiet source. He abandoned the plan of becoming a lawyer, angering his father and confusing those who thought they knew him. But he felt liberated. He began to spend time at Parisian salons, private gatherings where writers, thinkers, and aristocrats exchanged bold ideas that could not be spoken publicly. These places became his battlefield, and his weapon was language. At these salons, he met poets, scientists, and skeptics who dared to explore dangerous concepts, reason instead of dogma, equality instead of privilege, and truth instead of tradition. François absorbed everything. He wrote plays filled with sharp dialogue, poems that challenged authority, and letters that spread his ideas beyond Paris. His words began to move like flames in dry grass, exciting some, alarming others. Then came a pivotal transformation. To protect himself from scandal and to gain a memorable voice, François adopted a new name, Voltaire. No one knows with certainty why he chose it, but the name soon became a symbol of rebellion, wit, and fearless intelligence. With this new identity, he stepped fully into his mission. His pen became his sword, his mind his shield. However, Voltaire's growing fame brought danger. France was not a land where free speech was welcome. The Church guarded its power with holy authority. The monarchy demanded absolute loyalty. Anyone who questioned them risked being silenced. Voltaire's writings did more than question, they exposed. He pointed out injustices, mocked corruption, and revealed the absurdity of blind obedience. His humor was like lightning. It illuminated truths so clearly that powerful people felt attacked. And they were right to feel threatened. Voltaire believed that laughter could break chains. If people could laugh at a tyrant, then the tyrant's power weakened. If they could question authority, authority lost its magic. Voltaire once said, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." Those words alone were enough to shake a kingdom. But words came with a price. In 1717, when he was only 23, Voltaire wrote a satirical poem mocking the king's powerful allies. The reaction was immediate. He was arrested and sent to the Bastille, a cold, massive fortress that symbolized the cruelty of royal power. Inside those walls, surrounded by silence and iron, Voltaire faced his first true test. Would he surrender and return to a quiet life? Or would imprisonment ignite an even greater fire within him? He did not break. Instead, he wrote. He planned. He imagined a future where ideas were stronger than prisons. When he was finally released, he was more determined than ever. Yet, the world outside had changed. The authorities were now watching him closely. His words were dangerous. His voice could move crowds. His ideas no longer belonged only to him, they belonged to society. I wonder, if you were in his position, alone, imprisoned, punished for your thoughts, would you give up, or would you continue speaking your truth? Think carefully, because Voltaire's answer would shape the next chapter of history. With the fire inside him burning brighter than before, his journey was far from over. A greater conflict was coming, one that would transform him from a rebellious thinker into a philosopher who challenged the pillars of power themselves. Voltaire's first imprisonment in the Bastille had taught him a crucial truth: those in power feared ideas more than armies. But he did not yet understand how far that fear could go, or how deeply it could scar a man determined to speak freely. That understanding would come soon, through an incident so intense, so humiliating, and so violent, that it would transform him forever. It began with a conflict involving a nobleman named the Chevalier de Rohan. Rohan was born into aristocracy, a man who believed his bloodline made him superior to ordinary citizens. He enjoyed the luxury of privilege, and he expected everyone to respect him without question. Voltaire, however, respected no one simply because of their birth. For him, respect was earned by intelligence, character, and contribution, not inherited like a family title. One evening, inside a glittering Paris salon, Rohan attempted to mock Voltaire in front of the guests. With a smirk, he asked a cutting question, "Monsieur Voltaire, what is your real name?" His tone suggested that Voltaire, who came from a middle-class family, did not deserve the reputation he was building. Voltaire's reply was quick, sharp, and unforgettable. He answered, "I have no need of a name that I have made famous." His words struck the room like a slap. That single sentence wounded Rohan's pride more deeply than any sword could have. He was humiliated by a man who, according to noble standards, should have been beneath him. And humiliation, when mixed with power, can become cruelty. A few days later, Rohan sent his servants to attack Voltaire. They beat him brutally in the street while Rohan watched from a carriage, satisfied and untouchable. Voltaire, beaten and bleeding, demanded justice. He wanted to challenge Rohan to a duel, a gentleman's way of restoring honor. But society did not consider Voltaire a gentleman. He was a writer, a thinker, a man of words, not of noble blood. He was not allowed to fight a man of higher class. The authorities had a choice: protect Voltaire, or protect the nobleman. They chose the nobleman. Instead of punishing Rohan, the government arrested Voltaire again and sent him back to the Bastille. Imagine that moment: a man attacked in public not only receives no justice, but is punished for demanding it. Voltaire was furious. The world he had hoped to change now showed him its true face, one built not on reason or fairness, but on power, brutality, and silence. This was the moment that transformed anger into purpose. While locked away again, Voltaire confronted a truth that burned like fire: in a world controlled by kings and priests, justice was a privilege, not a right. Freedom of speech was not a gift, it was a battle. And battles required strategies. When he was released, Voltaire was given a choice: keep quiet, or leave France. He chose exile. He left for England, a decision that would change not only his life, but the future of Europe. England in the early 18th century was unlike France. Its system allowed open debate, scientific exploration, and criticism of the government. Ideas were not crimes. Philosophers like John Locke inspired discussions on liberty, rights, and the responsibility of rulers. Compared to France, England felt like another universe, one where thought was not chained. Voltaire was astonished. He read everything he could find. He studied English philosophy, admired the works of Isaac Newton, and observed a society where even the king could be questioned. Here, he found what he had been searching for: proof that another kind of world was possible. This discovery marked a turning point not only in his career, but in his soul. His exile was no longer punishment, it was rebirth. It gave him tools, language, and the intellectual weapons he needed to return to France not as a rebellious writer, but as a force capable of reshaping the foundations of civilization. He had suffered humiliation, defeat, and exile. But like a blade tempered in fire, he emerged sharper, stronger, and clearer in purpose. The struggle was no longer personal. It was philosophical. It was universal. And it was only beginning. When Voltaire returned to France after his years in England, he was no longer the same man who had been beaten in the streets of Paris. He came back armed with a new philosophy, a deeper understanding of human rights, and the confidence that change was not just desirable, it was possible. But every revolution begins with tension. The world Voltaire wanted to create collided violently with the world that already existed. He began publishing works inspired by what he had seen in England. His most influential early writing from that period was the Letters on the English, where he praised England's freedoms, open debate, religious tolerance, scientific progress, and a system of government that limited royal power. Although he never directly said that France was backward, the comparison was obvious. His words were a mirror, showing France its flaws. The authorities were furious. The French government banned the book, ordered it to be publicly burned, and issued a warrant for Voltaire's arrest. Once again, Voltaire fled. He had become a man constantly hunted, his ideas too powerful to ignore, his voice too dangerous to silence without consequence. Every step he took was a sacrifice. For writing truths others were afraid to even whisper, he gave up safety, comfort, and peace. Yet Voltaire refused to stop. He believed that silence was the true prison, not the Bastille. He moved to Cirey, near the border, and there, with the brilliant mathematician Émile du Châtelet, he created one of the most productive intellectual partnerships in history. Together they studied Newton, dissected old beliefs, and wrote works that challenged centuries of dogma. It was here, in a quiet country house, that Voltaire transformed from a rebel into a philosopher of the Enlightenment. But philosophy alone does not create legends. Legends are born at the crossroads of courage and danger. The turning point arrived through a tragedy that Voltaire could have ignored, but chose not to. In 1762, a man named Jean Calas, a Protestant in Catholic-dominated France, was falsely accused of killing his own son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. With no evidence, he was tortured and executed. The public celebrated his death. Religion had spoken. Authority was satisfied. But Voltaire was horrified. He saw not a crime, but a monstrous injustice driven by intolerance. His soul trembled with outrage. How could a society claim to be moral while destroying an innocent man? How could religion, meant to guide humanity to goodness, be used as a weapon of cruelty? Voltaire had a choice: do nothing and stay safe, or take a stand and risk everything. He chose the second path. He launched a relentless campaign to clear Calas' name, writing essays, letters, petitions, and arguments that spread across Europe. His message was simple but explosive: reason must replace superstition, justice must replace hatred, and no authority, not king, not church, should be above the truth. His crusade was not just intellectual. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. For Voltaire, the Calas affair was proof that silence was complicity. He once declared, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." He saw clearly that blind obedience was not innocence, it was poison. The battle lasted years. He faced threats, ridicule, and isolation. But this time, the world was listening. And slowly, the impossible happened: public opinion began to shift. The case was reopened. Evidence was re-examined. And eventually, Jean Calas was declared innocent, years after his death. Voltaire had moved mountains using nothing but words. This moment marked the climax of his life's struggle. Voltaire had now fully embraced his identity, not merely as a writer, but as a defender of humanity, someone willing to face kings, priests, and crowds, armed only with truth. His sacrifice was immense. He gave his life not to comfort, but to conflict. Yet in choosing conflict, he became something extraordinary, a voice that could not be stopped. Now, let me ask you, if you had the choice to risk everything for justice, your safety, your reputation, even your freedom, would you take it? Or would you step back and stay silent? Voltaire answered through action. His voice would soon echo across Europe. The tide had turned. Victory was near. After the Cala affair, Voltaire was no longer just a controversial writer, he had become the most powerful voice of reason in Europe. His victory was not a single event, but a transformation of culture itself. He showed that ideas could shake empires, that truth could cross borders, and that one pen could defeat centuries of fear. Voltaire continued to expose injustices with unstoppable energy. He defended other victims of religious intolerance, including families destroyed by false accusations and individuals condemned simply for thinking differently. Each time he raised his voice, he chipped away at the foundations of unquestioned authority. It was no longer possible for kings and churches to act without fear of scrutiny. Voltaire had awakened the European conscience. His writings traveled farther than he ever could. His most famous work, Candide, used satire to attack foolish optimism, blind obedience, and cruelty hidden behind noble words. Readers laughed at the absurdity of a world where suffering was ignored in the name of faith and tradition, but behind the laughter was a painful truth. Voltaire's satire forced people to think, and once a mind begins to think freely, it can never return to chains. Voltaire also became a symbol of tolerance. He did not claim that everyone must agree, only that everyone must have the right to speak. Though the phrase, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," was not written by him, it perfectly captures the essence of his beliefs. He inspired generations of thinkers who later helped shape democratic ideals around the world. His home at Ferney, near the border of Switzerland, became a sanctuary for refugees, thinkers, and anyone whose ideas were considered dangerous. Ferney was more than a house, it was a fortress of free thought. People traveled from distant lands to meet him, seeking advice, encouragement, and the courage to stand against oppression. Voltaire was no longer fighting alone, he had become the leader of a movement. His influence reached beyond philosophy. He supported scientific discoveries, promoted reforms in law, and encouraged education for ordinary people, not just the elite. He believed that a society could be changed only when its citizens learned to question, to analyze, and to imagine a better world. His dream was not to destroy religion or monarchy, but to illuminate them, to make them accountable, and to ensure that power served humanity rather than enslaving it. As he grew older, his reputation became unstoppable. Even kings who once feared him now sought his counsel. When he returned to Paris in 1778 after decades of exile, he was welcomed like a hero. Crowds gathered on the streets. People screamed his name. His plays were performed to thunderous applause. It was as if an entire nation finally understood what he had fought for. The man who once was beaten, mocked, exiled, and imprisoned now stood at the center of admiration. His ideas had won. He had not used violence. He had not commanded armies. His victory was one of spirit, intellect, and persistence. He proved that truth, once spoken, does not disappear. It grows. And so, Voltaire's triumph was not just personal, it was historical. His words shaped the Enlightenment, influenced revolutions, and helped plant the seeds of modern democracy. The very world we live in today still breathes the air he cleared. But every victory must find meaning in what it leaves behind. The true measure of a life is not applause, but legacy, and Voltaire's legacy was only beginning to unfold. Voltaire died in 1778, just as the world was preparing for the earthquake of revolutions that his ideas helped inspire. His body is long gone, but his words remain like sparks of fire, still capable of igniting critical thought in anyone who hears them. His legacy is not carved in stone, it lives in the freedom to speak, to question, and to disagree without fear. Voltaire taught humanity that truth does not demand obedience, it invites examination. He believed that progress begins when someone dares to say, "Is this right?" and refuses to accept silence as an answer. His writings did not end the injustices of his time, but they exposed the machinery behind them. They showed people that cruelty wrapped in tradition is still cruelty, and that respect without reason is simply submission. He left behind 3 lessons that continue to echo through history. The first is courage. Voltaire faced kings, priests, and mobs armed only with ideas. He proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else, truth, justice, human dignity, is worth more than safety. His life reminds us that real change never begins with permission, it begins with resistance. The second lesson is clarity. Voltaire believed that confusion is the weapon of tyrants. He encouraged people to think clearly, to ask questions, and to demand evidence. In his view, ignorance was not a condition, it was a choice, one that powerful people encouraged to maintain control. The third lesson is tolerance. Voltaire did not ask people to agree, he asked them to coexist. He understood that a society where people are punished for their thoughts is not a society, it is a prison. His dream was a world where disagreement is not a threat, but a path toward understanding. Today, his ideas live in every democratic constitution that protects free speech, in every classroom where students ask, "Why?" and in every moment when someone refuses to accept injustice quietly. Whenever you challenge an unfair rule, whenever you demand the truth, whenever you defend someone's right to speak even when you do not like what they say, you are continuing Voltaire's work. Before we move on, pause for a moment and ask yourself, in your own life, where do you need to speak with more courage, more clarity, or more tolerance? The answer to this question may be the beginning of your own revolution. Voltaire's legacy is not just a chapter in history, it is an invitation to every thinking mind. And it reminds us that sometimes, the most powerful force in the world is not the sword, the throne, or the church, but a single voice that refuses to be silent. And so, as the curtain falls on this extraordinary journey, we return to where we began, with a single man, armed not with armies, crowns, or miracles, but with sentences, questions, and ideas. Voltaire did not conquer cities. He did not command legions. Yet his influence reached further than most kings could ever dream. His true battlefield was the mind, and his victories are measured in the freedoms we now take for granted. Every time you speak your thoughts freely, every time you question authority, every time a journalist publishes an uncomfortable truth or a citizen dares to say, "Prove it," Voltaire is there, whispering across time. He knew that liberty is fragile. It can be lost quietly, one fear, one lie, one forbidden opinion at a time. That is why he fought not just against tyrants, but against ignorance, superstition, and the idea that people should obey instead of think. His life reminds us that progress does not begin with answers, it begins with questions. So, what about you? Will you accept what others tell you, or will you examine it? Will you fear ideas, or will you explore them? Will you be silent, or will you speak? Voltaire's greatest message is simple and eternal. You are responsible for the world you allow to exist. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story inspired you, helped your English, or sparked a thought worth keeping, please like, share, or comment. And as always, welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey of discovery, courage, and wisdom. The story ends here. But your thinking should only be beginning.